Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this afternoon, let's talk about Ibrahim, actually, Traore, who is the current captain and president of Burkina Faso. And someone asked me to talk about what is happening there, what my thoughts are, my reflections on Ibrahim and what is happening in that West African country of Burkina Faso. Now, I am not an expert on Africa and on what is happening there. I'm more an expert of what is happening in the Caribbean and also in Latin America. And that is where my studies lie. So, first of all, I ask you to forgive me if I do err and I err on the side of caution because I'm no expert, but I can, as a person who thinks and someone who realizes that human beings are, or characteristics tend to be more of the same than we think. And because we are humans and we have human nature, and human nature does some things, right? Or certain things. And if you're also a student of history, as I am, and you follow what has happened during or throughout the period of some aspects of African history. Now, not because I'm not an African expert, doesn't mean that I have not read some African history. I did lots of Black studies when I was at university. So therefore, I have some amount of knowledge and expertise. Not that I am the expert, not that I am the known one to be speaking on the matter. So Ibrahim, it's Ibrahim, not his, I'm saying Abraham, but it's Ibrahim Traore, right? So it's Ibrahim Traore is the leader, and he has taken over from Paul Henry Damibe, the captain and the president that he has succeeded. And that was a military coup that he launched on that former president. Now, a fun fact that is interesting about Burkina Faso, of the 65 years that it has been, since its independence, since it has been an independent nation, of that 65 years of independence, 45 of those years are under a military junta, right? That they are under a military power. So that is a militaristic, a militarized society, a militarized country. It is no, by any sort of the imagination, it is not a democracy. So those of you who are thinking that Burkina Faso is a democracy, it is not. Now, we also have to understand that democracy is a very subjective term. We have, what United States, for example, thinks when it's spreading democracy around the world, it's spreading militarism. That's what it is spreading. So it's the form of militarism that Burkina Faso prefers, or the people there, or the leader, Ibrahim Traore, might be the militarism of his local people, that his local people desire, not that the United States desire, which is imperialism, to impose Americanism and their interests. And oftentimes not the interests of the ordinary Americans, but the interests of the American elites, economic elites, and military elites that the United States desires to put on them. But without further ado, let's get into some of the facts about Burkina Faso. I'm here and I'm on Britannica, and it suggests here on Britannica, Burkina Faso, landlocked country in West Africa. The country occupies an extensive plateau, and its geography is characterized by a savanna that is grassy in the north and gradually gives way to sparse forests in the south. So it's a Western African country. A former French colony, it gained independence as Upper Volta in 1960. The name Burkina Faso, which means land of incorruptible people. So that is what the meaning of Burkina Faso, for those of you who do not know, the country has a meaning, which means the land of incorruptible people. Very great name, very honorable and noble name to have for a country. Was adopted in 1984. Oh, so it was given that name in 1984. And that would have been under the presidency of Thomas Sankara. And for those of you who don't know, Thomas Sankara was also another president, a former president of Burkina Faso. And he became president, I think, in 1980, also under a military coup, because as we're saying, of the 45 years, the 65 years since they've been independent, 45 of those years have been under a military occupation, under military juntas. So he was also another revolutionary president, that's of Burkina Faso, that is Thomas Sankara. And he also came to the presidency when he was extremely young as Ibrahim Traore. Ibrahim Traore is 37 years old and he became president. He actually launched that coup against the former president, who was Damibe, Paul Henry Damibe, and in which, you know, he took over powers, and that he took over powers of Burkina Faso, that's Ibrahim Traore, at the tender age of 33 years old, 34, some say, years old. And Thomas Sankara managed to have done the same. So many people are equating Ibrahim Traore to the likes of Thomas Sankara, who was a revolutionary Marxist during the era of the Cold War. So he wanted, just like Ibrahim Traore, Thomas Sankara wanted to rid the country of imperialism, of Western imperialism, French and American imperialism. He wanted to nationalize a lot of the natural resources that there are in Africa, that Africa has, because Africa as a continent is rich in natural resources. Let us remember that Africa is a continent. It is not a country, as many people think. Even Black people, when we talk about Africa, it's almost like we're saying it's Black people, and these Black people are uniformed, they are homogenous, which they are not homogenous. They are distinctive peoples, right, with distinctive cultures, nationalities, and ethnicities. And we have to really delve into what these terminologies mean. Culture, the way of life of a people, right? So the way Ghanaians behave, or people from Ghana, are not the same way that, you know, Nigerians behave. So we have to understand that. And we need to understand, when we talk about Africa, that we're not talking about just a landmass with homogenous people. When we speak about Black people the same, we're not talking about one people, you know, because people who you define, or whom you define as Black in Brazil, are distinctive people than people who you define as Black in America, right? Because their cultures are different. Their even racial and ethnic mixture is different from what you would see in North America. So we have these two presidents, one a former president who was murdered, who was actually assassinated. Some are suggesting that the French actually killed him, that's Thomas Sankara, because of course he wanted to nationalize and to, you know, to develop Burkina Faso in the interest of the people, and to develop their skills, to develop their natural resources, and not to have them sent abroad, right? Because as we're learning now, Ibrahim, keep on saying, forgive me, it's Ibrahim Traore, he actually wants to, he desires to, oh, I think he has already built a refinery institution place of gold, of refining gold, right? Where the gold that they have, because it's a gold-rich country, a country rich in gold. And he has built a refinery center in which the gold can be actually refined, rather than sending it, the raw gold, to France to be refined and to be sent back, and then to be sold at a higher price. So that's good. And he's also trying to build schools, as Thomas Sankara did, hospitals, right? He's trying also to develop the domestic agriculture so that people can eat what they grow. They can be self-sufficient, and they do not have to depend on people to feed them. Because as Thomas Sankara suggested, the former president of Burkina Faso, he who feeds himself, right, is independent. the person who depends on another man to feed him is going to be dependent. So even if you are saying that you are you are an independent country, but most of your food is coming from abroad, is being imported, the country is not independent, right? The country is not independent, and that is what a lot of us have to learn. Now, let's look at some interesting points and facts presented about Ibrahim Traore. Who is he? Who is Ibrahim Traore? Now, that question is posed by Conversation, the newspaper online. Traore was born in 1988 in Bondaki, or Kai, a small town on the route connecting Burkina Faso's second city, Bobo Dioulasso, and its fourth largest, Guaigoya. He completed secondary school in Bobo Dioulasso, then moved to the nation's capital, where he studied at the University of Ouagadougou. Right, so that is, I think the capital is Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. After completing his undergraduate education, Traore joined the army in 2010 at the age of 22. He undertook his officer training in Po at the George's Nomano Military Academy, an officer school for the Burkinabe Armed Forces. He graduated as a second lieutenant or lieutenant in 2012 and served as a peacekeeper in the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission to Mali after being promoted to lieutenant in 2014. So he actually worked for the United Nations and was on their peacekeeping force. That was the peacekeeping mission that was actually placed or located in Mali. After his stint with MINUSMA, Traore took part in missions in northern Burkina Faso as part of a special counterterrorism unit. He was promoted to captain in 2020 at the age of 32. Damiba led a coup against Kabore in January 2022. He then assigned Traore as chief of an artillery regiment in the north-central region of Burkina Faso. So he is actually a captain. As it became clear that Damiba was losing popularity within the junta, Traore and a group of junior officers organized a coup. They seized on public and military outrage around an ambush that left 11 soldiers and dozens of civilians dead. All right. So that is what we're seeing in Burkina Faso, that we're seeing that there are contending forces on the ground, contending political and economic forces on the ground who are vying for the dominion of that gold-rich country, all right, Burkina Faso. Now, I would like to ask, what are some of the characteristics or the attributes that based on what I have read, based on my research, what are some of the characteristics or the attributes of Ibrahim Traore? I would think that, he's young, right? He's 37 years old, and he actually launched that coup d'etat in 2000, I think 22, when he was at the age of 34. So he's now 37 years. So he's a young man, right? He's extremely smart. I understand based on my research that he studied geology at university, and that he graduated at the top of his class. A very courageous and military man he is, right? To be taking on France and the United States and these Western countries, you have to be full of courage. You must. And he has to be valiant. Militaristic he is, right? Because he is a military person. That's his training. He's trained in the military. Now, we must understand that because he's a military guy and he has been trained in the military is an undemocratic institution. The military is an undemocratic institution. So therefore, you cannot expect Traore to be democratic. So I would list him as undemocratic. Maybe he's not the dictator that you're thinking when you think about undemocratic, but we must be careful when we have military juntas, because eventually sometimes they start off nice and then they turn into very despotic leaders. We have to be careful. Now we have, we can describe him, or I would describe him as being patriotic citizen of Burkina Faso. He desires to see his country grow and not to just have his country be at the whims of these imperialists who do whatever they want to do with that country. He is revolutionary because he is transforming his country into a fully independent society. Of course, it had some independence before, but it was not fully, just like many countries aren't, right? It was not a fully independent country. So he wants the country to work in the interest or work for the interest of its own citizens and not in and for the interests of foreigners. And that is what we have to do. This whole neoliberal ideology is something that is synonymous with slavery. It is synonymous with slavery. And for the life of me, I don't know why most of our governments in many of our so-called third world countries and the global south continue to stick with that agenda. But I can say that, yes, I understand because they are reaping the benefits. They're being paid to do so. I would suggest also that Ibrahim Traore is also a high risk taker. For him to be taking on the United States, do you know that AFRICOM, which is the African center there that, deals with U.S. interests, that is the U.S.'s military outposts in Africa. You have the United States is everywhere. So you have CENTCOM, I think that is in Central American countries. You have Southcom in South America, and you also have AFRICOM. Is AFRICOM? Yes, AFRICOM, I think it is. And I understand that the United States invests in that AFRICOM center, that militaristic agent or agency. They invest $2 billion in that agency per year. $2 billion. So to put that into proper context or into proper perspective, that the United States is investing so much money into AFRICOM. Can you imagine the sort of power that the United States has on that continent? Has a lot of power. So it means, therefore, I doubt the fact that, well, now that Burkina Faso has actually sent the French away, and they have now domesticated their gold reserves, I think now perhaps they'll be able to generate funds to launch an all-out war against the United States. Perhaps. We hope that he will be successful, because haven't we seen these leaders before? Haven't we seen these in the lives of Nkrumahs? We have seen these before. We have seen the lives of Michael Manley of Jamaica, Maurice Bishop of Grenada, right? We have the Burnhams of Guyana, of British Guyana. We have seen these, what we call Black leaders, these strong, visionary Black leaders who wanted the best for their countries, but who were not successful because there were more powerful forces that came up against them, right? More powerful forces that came up against them. But we hope that Ibrahim is a genuine guy. He's sincere in his undertaking, because, again, we do not know who this guy really is. There are lots of questions which surround him. He's still an enigma, right? Ibrahim Traore is still an enigma. Nobody really knows a lot about him, right? They don't know. And in fact, there was an article written in the Responsible Statecraft, and this is an online, commentary newspaper that I read almost every day. And there was an article written by this paper, very well-respected paper online. And the journalist there, or the person who wrote this article, was questioning whether or not Ibrahim, because he worked for the United Nations, if the United States, which controls the United Nations, had any responsibility or played any part in the training of Ibrahim Traore. And when they contacted the US authorities, they said that they could not, they don't know. And they have no trace, or they didn't have the ability to retrace, his educational background to see if the United States might have trained him in one way or the other. Remember, we have the School of the Americas in Georgia, in the United States, in which these militaristic leaders are trained. And many of these leaders who return to their countries, they often form military juntas. So I'm not suggesting here that Ibrahim Traore was trained by the United States. I'm not suggesting that. Nobody knows. I'm just saying that there are lots of questions that we can't answer. The United States has access to a lot of information. It has a lot of intelligence agencies. I think it has about 16 intelligence agencies. The United States should be able to trace the educational history of Ibrahim Traore. But when the newspaper contacted them, the authorities in the United States, they were suggesting that they could not trace his educational development or history. That is something that is interesting. Now, what are some of the negative attributes of Ibrahim based on what I am looking at? He has to be paranoid right now, because if, 45 of the 65 years of independence, they have been having military juntas. So it's one military junta after the other. It means, therefore, that he's constantly got to watch his back. He's got to watch his back constantly, because there are internal interests and there are external interests who will defeat him, who might launch another coup against him. Remember that he launched a coup against the former president. So it seems like Burkina Faso is known to be a country in which many coups are launched against successive presidents. So he must be paranoid. He has to be constantly watching his back and has to be skeptical about everybody with whom he is dialoguing. And how can you run a country if you constantly got to watch your back? If you constantly have to watch your back. Now, I think that Ibrahim is also unrealistic about the future. We're living in a global world, whether we like it or not. We're no longer living in nation states, in independent nation states as we think we are. And the United States citizens are now finding out, at least some of them, realizing that their society is not independent, but that these elites, whether they come from America or Africa or the Caribbean or Asia, they are the ones who are running the show, and that they don't limit their nationalities to one particular country. In fact, I was reading the other day comments by Americans, on the program Redacted that I sometimes watch, in which Americans were suggesting, or some of the comments in the comment section, some of the people were suggesting there that Americans, their leaders, should not have dual citizenship, which means, therefore, that they understand that if things don't work in America, then they can go wherever they want to go, because they would have another citizenship somewhere else. But that is very, very common among the elites, that they don't believe in nationality. They are not patriotic as we think they are. They're only patriotic as far as economic, military, and political interests are concerned. And that is what we have to understand. So when we talk about the trade war between the United States and China, we're talking about the interests of the economic elites. Now, the economic elites are not also homogenous. They are a pluralistic group, and they have different interests, and they do have their infightings also. So we have to look at that. So when you look at Kamala, when you look at Trump, you have to look at what interests, what economic, military, political interests are they defending, and which interest within that group is going to win. All right, so Trump is representing a certain militaristic group, a certain economic group and interests, and that is why he won. He won the other group fighting against him, but not over the interests of the ordinary Americans, but over the interests of themselves, right? You have to understand that. Now, there are some things I would like to ask here about how we are viewing this, what the developments in Burkina Faso. I find it very interesting that as a group of people of African descent, I'm not going to use the word black because, you know, I don't like that word, but let us say people of African descent. I think that there is a lot of hypocrisy in us because you will find, for example, that the same black person, what you call black, let me use the word black since you understand that term and that is what is commonly used, right? The same black person who is in Jamaica, you know, cheering on the likes of Ibrahim Traore and what he's doing to fight against Western imperialism, are the same ones in Jamaica who are cheering on the likes of Mark Golding, the opposition leader in Jamaica, and the Prime Minister, Dr. Andrew and their, you know, enthusiasm for neoliberal ideologies, for supporting neoliberal ideologies, which is, of course, an extension of American and Western imperialism. But yes, you are going to cheer Ibrahim Traore, but you're also cheering Andrew and Mark Golding, or you're cheering on Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, who are also operating within that ideology of imperialism. Because as the writer in the Black Agenda report suggested, each American president practices neoliberalism at home and imperialism abroad. So every policy that is in, or all the policies in Jamaica are imperialistic because it is governed and it is run by US foreign policy, which is an imperialistic, which has, I should suggest, an imperialistic agenda. Now, Black people desire African redemption. It's almost like we think we're going to go back. We dream of going back to Africa, even though many of us are not connected to Africa. Even in spite of our resemblance or phenotype, you know, you look at me and you say, this guy's African, but am I, in terms of my cultural sensitivities, in terms of my awareness, in terms of my perspective, am I African? We have to ask ourselves these questions. So we want to return. Hello, Mama Africa, as we like to say. How are you? All right, we desire to go back to Africa. But are we culturally, linguistically, nationally the same as Africans are? Do we behave the same way? Do we eat the same foods? Do we enjoy and have the same interests? These are some of the questions that we have to ask. Do we have the same religion? Because some of the time we think that we are homogenous, but we are not homogenous people. We are distinctive, and we have distinctive religions, distinctive foods, distinctive cultures. We must be aware of these things. Now, I'm asking the question, aren't we a more textured group of people than just Black? We have to ask ourselves, are we not more than just being Black? And what does Black mean? What does it signify? Right? And that is what we have to ask ourselves. When you say you're Black, what do you mean that you're Black? That you're from Africa and that's where it stops, that you're Black? Right? And I often hear African Americans saying that, and I often have to correct them. Right? Blackness doesn't mean anything. In the same way, whiteness does not mean anything. It is the country, the culture to which you are affiliated. When you go to Europe, or you go to Asia, but let's begin with Europe. The British do not think that they're Russians, and the Russians don't think that they're Italians. In fact, they don't like each other, right? They don't even like each other. Even those of Western Europe, they are distinctive cultures with distinctive languages, with distinctive modes of behaviors, with distinctive perspectives, right? Religions. We have to understand that. But we tend to simplify, as it were, the whole perspective of whiteness and blackness, particularly in our universities. And that is why I don't think people are going to learn much at the university level, because they do that ad nauseum, talk about this whiteness, blackness, imperialism versus, militarism, and all these things are necessary, but we have to know that they have to be studied and have to be looked at in a textured manner, and not just to be seen in the simplistic way of looking at white people and black people, because that don't mean anything. And if you study World War II and World War I, you'll see that whiteness don't mean anything. They went there and they killed off a lot of people. Asian people also, the Chinese hate the Japanese, right? And perhaps vice versa. They don't see each other as similar people, even though they live on the same continent. So when we say Asian people, and Americans like to simplify everything, they think that everything should go into the microwave or the micro oven and just be baked. It doesn't work like that with people. It does not work like that with people. We must understand that, and that's why we have to sit back and study and read. Right? Now, who gave this black identity to black people? Who gave that? Who told us that we were black? Because that is a European construct. Africans never called themselves black before they came in contact with Europeans, right? I have a lot of Jamaicans, and I would say that myself, that when they did not know that they were black until they went to America. And yes, they knew that they had a certain color, that the color was not another color. They knew, they're not stupid, but it's this sort of emphasis on being black in America that is very foreign to Caribbean people, right? It's not our culture. That's not Caribbean culture. The other day I was also listening to a program, a podcast about the election of the new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. And there was an African-American pastor who was suggesting that, yes, black people are going to love the fact that the Pope has African heritage. He's of African descent by his mother's side, whose ancestors were or are from Haiti. Now, maybe to the African American, but to the normal Caribbean person, that doesn't mean anything. Having a black pope doesn't mean anything to him or her, right? He might just say it just to say it, but it does not mean anything, okay? Because as I asked online when I was on the program, because I tend to sometimes be cheeky, I said that, is he culturally black? He might be based on how Americans define black, because that's Americans' definition of blackness. Because race is a subjective ideology. It is a social construct. Blackness means much different on this. People have a different understanding of blackness in Brazil than they would have an understanding of blackness in America. People in Jamaica have a different understanding of blackness than people would say in Africa. Okay? We have to understand that. So we need not to simplify or oversimplify, such as I should suggest, what we mean by when we use these words. Okay? Now, we tend to look at Africa and we want to return to Africa. But what are our plans to rebuild Africa? Marcus Garvey had plans, and we could see it when you read them. He had workable, practicable plans to rebuild Africa. And he was trying to say the best of us should go there. No, Marcus Garvey did not, as some people are suggesting, that he wanted all black people to move back to Africa. That is not true. Marcus Garvey wanted the most able-bodied people, the people with strong, robust intellect, to go back, and also who had a high spiritual sensibility to civilize and to bring Africa back to the modern world. That's what he wanted. But many of us have not built ourselves in this Americas where we are, so we have nothing to give back to Africa. Right? So we can forget about going back there, because what most of us will be doing is going there to destroy Africa, right? To destroy the continent or whatever country we find ourselves in, whether it's Ghana or it's Nigeria or Ethiopia. Now, our so-called Black people, those of us who call ourselves Black people, our so-called Black people building the communities in which we live, what impressions are we giving of people of African descent? That we just like to dance and we just like to smoke marijuana and we don't want to speak well. We do not want to educate ourselves. We don't want to be refined. But we are hoping that this political messiah will come. And the same thing happened in 2008 when Barack Obama came into power. Only that you do not know that Barack Hussein Obama is a cousin of George W. Bush. And they had interactions when they were young. And there was no way that he was going to come and, because he was culturally more white in terms of American culture than Black, again, in terms of the United States culture. Culturally, Barack Hussein Obama is white and he's Black. You're just looking at the superficial and not looking at the substance. You have to look at substance and not at superficiality, which most of us as people of African descent tend to do. What is the economic vision for the African continent? What is our economic vision? Are we just simply thinking that if we rid Africa of imperialism, of Western imperialism, to be specific, that we are just going to magically become a prosperous and a proud continent? I think that we need to think more about where we think we're heading economically as a continent. But then again, the African continent is not united. We have the African Union, but who was the African Union formed by? The same Western people, right? You'll see a lot of Black faces, but still controlled by Western people, right? Just like CARICOM. Who controls the Caribbean community? The Westerners, Americans, American imperialism. They just go there and you see their faces and you think that they're in charge, but they are not in charge. Very important that you understand that. And that is why we have to dig into more. We need more information about Ibrahim Traore before we can say that, yes, he is the real deal and that he's going to walk the talk. Yes, his proposal sounds very good. And to nationalize everything or 60% of the economy, that is what all of us need to do. In fact, if many of us, if we really want to support Ibrahim Traore and Burkina Faso, we should be having similar movements within our own communities in which we are coercing our governments, be they in America, be they in Jamaica or Trinidad or wherever in Brazil, to follow the likes of Ibrahim Traore, to nationalize at least 60% of the economy. Because everything in these countries, for the most part, are privatized. Everything is sold off. And these private sector guys are there to make money, not to render service. And the government is there to what? To render service. Right? And that is what we have. So we see that conflict going on, and we have to be aware of the conflict, and we have to join hands and heart together. Remember now that Marcus Garvey was not building Africa in Africa. He was building it outside of Africa. His base was in the Americas, whether it was in the United States or in Jamaica or wherever he went. He was trying to build from there, to build Africa from there. What are we doing within the Americas? Those of us who are here, and our ancestors have been here for centuries. What are we doing to build our communities in our neck of the woods? What are we doing? Not much. Looks rather depressing. When you look at the United States, do you know, and this was years ago, so I'm sure perhaps it's much more money now, that Black people in America, the so-called Black African Americans, they amount to, it's a $10 trillion economy. Yet still, what do they own? What institutions, what valuable institution do Black Americans own in the United States? Yet still, their wealth values $10 trillion, but still controlled by the white majority. Still controlled. They're still controlled by the white majority because we're so materialistic. All we are concerned about is the cars and the houses and the name brand clothes and shoes that we're wearing, and it has nothing to do with the development of our minds. And that is where we are going to be extinct. We're going to become extinct if we do not. And when I mean extinct, I don't mean we're going to just disappear, magically disappear, because it won't happen. But we will be slaves. We'll enslave ourselves to a superior people who think outside of the box and who are not just about material gains. And even though, yes, they might be about material gains, but they want to develop. We like to the here and now and to brag on nonsensical things. Is the African continent made up of just one people, or does Africa comprise distinct and divergent countries? It does. So Burkina Faso is different from Ghana or different from Nigeria. Now, we can say that we have a similar problem of Western imperialism. We have to work against Western imperialism, and we can unite our forces in doing that. But oftentimes, there's so many interests, and Black people can be very hypocritical because we can show one face here, and then behind the scenes, we are doing another thing. Very, very hypocritical people we are. And perhaps slavery helped us to master that hypocritical tendency because we had to show or master one face and then show the likes of other people another face, your brother and your sister. So you know how to play the game. And you look at their eyes, you look into our faces, and you can see that we are, in fact, double-faced. Does the Asian continent comprise homogeneous peoples? No, they don't. The Chinese are different from the Japanese, and you have the Vietnamese, and you have the Indians, and you have the Koreans. Oh, they're not homogeneous people. And we are also not homogeneous people, right? So we need to move away from this simplistic understanding of what Blackness means. And we need to more look at cultures, religions, economies, philosophies, and see how we can study the history of each country as much as we can, or we can't study the history of all countries, but at least as many as we can. And the more you study the history of many countries, is the more you are going to see parallels, because human nature is the same. And then you'll begin to understand what is happening in the world, particularly in Burkina Faso. Because we must begin to look carefully and in depth at what is happening economically, politically, militarily, right? And see if it's our interests, are our interests being defended, or is it that Ibrahaim Traore is defending the interests of the elites, of the people who are aiding and abetting him. Now, let me end here. In terms of Ibrahim joining hands and heart with Russia and Cuba and China, do you think that's going to be permanent or sustainable? I don't think so. Because remember now that Russia is also defending her interests, and China also. These are countries that are antagonistic toward Black people, African people. If you go to Russia, I've heard horror stories about Russia. in China also, but more so in Russia, where Black people have had very, very terrible experiences in Russia. You can be rushed or jumped at any given moment just for being Black, for just being there, right? So do you think really that Russia has sincere interest or has this sort of uh, solidarity with the likes of Burkina Faso? I don't think so. I think what they want, if they can compete with Western interest in terms of developing the nation to get what they want out of the nation, yes, that is what they're doing there. So we are caught up in a very sticky battle and warfare, and we don't know how we are going to be able to extricate ourselves out of this mess of Western imperialism. Because at a given moment, it seems like you're having a good time, it seems like you're achieving something, and then you are going to be overtaken, especially now that we live in a globalized economy, in a global village. It's very difficult to separate yourself or yourselves from and just be a nation state to yourself. That should have been the intended goal, but that goal has already been defeated. So I would say good luck to Ibrahim Traore. I hope that he will be able to succeed. But I do not think, based on my understanding of history, based on my expertise in political science and current affairs, I don't think that he's going to be able to defeat the economic, military, and political interests of the United States and its Western allies. It's very, very sad to say that, and I'm not being defeatist. I'm more of a pragmatist, and I hope that you understand that. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe, like the videos, so the videos can be shared with as many people on the platform. See you in another one. Adios.